Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Allison Poklemba, one of Humboldt County Office of Education's environmental literacy coaches. And thanks for being here for our Deepening Sense of Place series. I appreciate you making time for this opportunity. And I hope that over this next half hour or so, we will both deepen your background knowledge about environmental concepts and help add to your toolkit for incorporating outdoor learning experiences in your education work. So I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge where we gather and that the land where I'm zooming to you from this afternoon on the Humboldt coast sits in the unceded, traditional, ancestral, and present homelands of the Wiyot tribe in an area now called Neeland. And in this series, we are viewing the environment around our homes and schools through a series of different lenses. So far, we've looked through the lenses of wildfire, climate, water, soil and decomposers, plants, and now today, taking a closer look at animals. I also want to acknowledge that a common theme between the sessions in this series has been the importance and the power of observation. That this basic skill applies to anyone of any age, and yet it can always be refined. And also that observation is at the foundation of science. And I think that Rachel Carson's quote here sums up the connection between observation and the development of environmental literacy. So I'll read that for you. The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction. So really part of what we're doing by looking more closely at the world of animals today is noticing more. And in the process of noticing comes caring. And what we're going to do, Karen is going to give us an awesome overview of what it means to be an animal. How are animals different than other things? And she'll look at animal diversity and also animal diversity of our north coast of California. Some quick overview of how to identify animals, what their needs are, how they interact, and then also looking for animal signs. And then I will take the theory of what she's done and convert it into a simple outdoor exploration activity for you and your students. And I'll also glance over some lessons and resources that we've curated for you to help really make looking at the world through the lens of animals part of your curriculum. And then at the end, we'll take any questions. So let me just introduce you to Karen. She is a biology professor at College of the Redwoods, where she teaches zoology, human anatomy, marine biology, and natural history. She trains UC naturalists through the natural history course and has mentored numerous independent study students interested in natural history museum curation. She's been a regular participant in College of the Redwoods' famous Science Night, which I bet many of you have participated in, with the activities of how to stuff a chipmunk and why you would want to, about taxidermy, Critters in a Dish, about tidal invertebrates, and Everybody Poops, about matching scats to their mammals. Her research career has included work on mammal intestinal physiology, bird embryonic development, ant-eating mammal feeding, and most recently, chipmunk biogeography and speciation. Despite being a mammologist by training, she likes plants too, especially desert plants and pines. Her favorite hobby is backpacking in California mountains, where her favorite activity is listening to the sound of the wind through the pines. I just adore Karen and her approach to both education and science, and I'm so happy that she could be our visiting scientist for today's session. So let's welcome Karen.
Hi there. Let's see, there we go. Do you guys see my screen?
Whoops. Yes, looks good.
Keep you guys from seeing all the clutter on my desktop. All right, thank you so much for that really nice introduction. If anything, it made me even more excited to be here. I sound like such a wonderful person.
You are.
So I'm starting with this screen that just has some pictures of some of my favorite animals. That's a pangolin in the lower left, which is what I spent a big chunk of my life working on, anteaters and pangolins. And I work on chipmunks now, and that's what you have in the upper right. But despite all of that, I love nudibranchs, which is what we see in the upper left, and salamanders. And we have lots of nudibranchs and salamanders locally. I want to start with, whoops, let's see. I want to start with hopefully my cursor working. There we go. With a definition of animals because usually people think of animals as things that move, and that's actually not a very good way to think about them, because other things move too, and sometimes animals don't move much, if at all. So a technical definition of animals is that they are the organisms who are eukaryotic, multicellular, collagen-containing heterotrophs. And eukaryotic means that their cells have a nucleus. Multicellular means they're made of lots of cells, and their cells are held together by a protein called collagen. And then heterotrophy, which is going to be a big focus of everything I have to say here, means literally other eaters. Animals eat other things. They get their energy and carbon sources from other animals. And so the big question mark here, which of these things are animals? And this paramecium is not multicellular, and this fern is not a heterotroph. And this mushroom, while being a multicellular heterotroph, actually doesn't have cells held together by collagen. So if we take a look, this is what we've got left. Okay, these are our animals from that last picture. And they're ranging in size. The animals on the planet are ranging in size from zooplankton to blue whales, the largest currently extant animal on the planet. And zooplankton, just to make sure you're aware, plankton by definition are any tiny things that float. This could be in the ocean or in pond water or stream water. And the smallest plankton are phytoplankton. So those are tiny things that float that photosynthesize. Zooplankton are the smallest animals. And these can be very, very, very small kinds of animals, or it could be the embryos or larvae of animals. And so if you take a microscope out, you'll find that the ocean waters are teeming with animals, but we don't see them with the naked eye. So animals are heterotrophs. That means that they are the organisms that eat other organisms. And I had a professor once who started zoology by saying that this is a real fundamental ethical dilemma for animals, because it doesn't matter if you are a vegan or a vegetarian or a meat-hungry carnivore, you are still living off the dead or dying bodies of other organisms. And this is so fundamental to every aspect of animal biology. It's got to be considered over and over and over again whenever you have questions about animals. What is their food and how does that affect their life? So what we have here is, first of all, my homage to plants. Plants are incredible, right? They grow out of thin air. They get, every organism on the planet needs carbon to build their molecules with. Every organism on the planet needs energy to build molecules and to do stuff, to actually do work in their daily life, whether that's metabolic work or physical work. And plants are incredible because they absorb energy from the sun and CO2, they get carbon from their CO2 and it's invisible. And then they grow, you know, apples and redwoods and all kinds of things. And it's kind of magic. And animals are the ones that are then, you know, yielding the fruits, reaping the fruits of autotroph or photosynthesizer work. And so what we have here are just a few animals eating. We've got a black brant, which is a local goose type bird, which eats eelgrass, definitely a vegetarian. The red tree vole lives on Douglas fir needles. Moving on to some more carnivorous animals, anemones. This is the giant green anemone closed up. And they might look really beautiful when they're sitting in a tide pool. In fact, they're voracious carnivores. And here we have an anemone that's eating a crab. And I once saw 3 anemones sharing a ½ meter long octopus tentacle. We got a sea otter, always worthy of a cute factor here, eating sea urchins, and then a real carnivore, a bobcat eating squirrel. But animals are always eating something, and it rules their life. So before we get into heterotrophy more, how many animals are there? If you look at iNaturalist, we got about 194,000 worldwide, but that's just the ones that people have posted pictures of. So that's biased towards macroscopic animals. If you turn to the Encyclopedia of Life, which is an online resource run by the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian, they've got 1.3 million species worldwide. Now, these are all ones that are referenced in a museum collection. So that's still probably a vast underestimate of what's on the planet, but that's good enough for us today. And when you're talking about animals, if you're going to talk about the different kinds of animals, the best way to organize your thinking about animal diversity is by phyla. So there's roughly 35 phyla. And just to remind you, here's our basic Linnaean hierarchy of taxonomic ranks. And so we are in the domain Eukarya. That's all the things with a nucleus in the cell. And we are in the kingdom Animalia. And within the animals, within the kingdom of animals, we have many different phyla. So that's the guided tour I'm about to give you will be to the phyla. If you look at a pie chart of all the phyla, that big gigantic blue blob in the pie chart are the arthropods. So the arthropods are all animals that have an exoskeleton that that covers a jointed body and jointed appendages. So they've got, you know, joints like us, but an exoskeleton. These are going to be crabs and other things. We'll see them in a minute. So they're the vast majority of animals. Okay, most animals are arthropods. But this little quote here: "There's only 35 kinds of animals, and most of them are weird." Okay, that's from a BBC writer. And the point I want to make here is that this green wedge here, these are the so-called minor phyla or lesser phyla. These are the ones that she's referring to as weird. And most of them are microscopic, and they're actually everywhere. They're in the plankton, they're in the soil, and they're in moss and pond scum. They're very abundant, but they're microscopic and they are weird. And these are things like, this like the charismatic animal of the year, the water bear or moss piglet. In its own phylum, the tardigrada. Gastrotrix are another weird one. Sipunculans are a little bigger, and we do see them around, so maybe they don't quite classify as minor phyla. But most animals you're not even seeing, okay? But here are some of the more conspicuous ones. This is a phylogenetic tree to relatively familiar animals, showing their, at least a hypothesis of their evolutionary relationships. And I'm going to breeze through like 10 slides, and I'm gonna try really hard not to say anything about anybody on any of the slides. But if you have questions about any of the animals, please put them in the Q&A, save them for later. Okay, this is my discipline. I have to discipline myself here. So we've got the porifera, the sponges, phylum Cnidaria, anemones, jellyfish, corals, by the wind sailors, manowar. So many worms. There's so many wormy phyla. Okay, these are roughly oriented clockwise on this screen. So we've got our flatworms, roundworms. These are all segmented worms, ribbon worms, peanut worms, phoronid worms. All of these worms are in a different phylum. They're that distinct from one another to be in a different phylum. And all of these worms are quite common here in the Humboldt Bay area. And there's worm phyla that I don't even have on this slide. There's a lot of worms out there in animal land. Phylum Bryozoa, the moss animals. Phylum Mollusca, I think most of us know mollusks pretty well. Phylum Arthropoda, the jointed ones I was talking about before, and they're including 3 subphyla because they're such a big group. So we have tick spiders, scorpions in one group, and then we have all the crustaceans, crabs and lobsters and barnacles in another group, and then the insects are the third group within the arthropods. Very, very diverse. We've got phylum Echinodermata, sea stars and brittle stars and sea urchins and sea cucumbers. Phylum Chordata. So this is our phylum, but there's 2 groups other than the vertebrates in this phylum. And this first group over here, these are tunicates, solitary and colonial, and this is a salp, which we see washed up locally. This is a subphylum that's not found locally, but these are all chordates. These are relatives of ours. And then there's the vertebrates, and we've got all the fish, including lamprey and sharks and salmon and crazy coral reef fish. Amphibians, reptiles, birds. Never, ever forget that birds are dinosaurs. Okay, I have a real love-hate relationship with birds, but this is a reconstruction of a dinosaur fossil, and feather imprints were found with the fossil. So this picture in the lower right is actually a dinosaur with feathers. And there's a very fine line between a dinosaur with feathers and a bird, which we won't get into, but that's a great story. And then there's mammals. Okay. All right. I got through all those slides really quickly. So If you want to identify mammals, and I mean, excuse me, not mammals, animals, if you want to identify animals, you can use the usual resources, and you can use field guides, and there's lots of good ones out there. I love keying. I think it's great to teach people how to key because it's such a great skill. There's some good keys out there. Online resources are so abundant and getting better. But the sorts of questions that you always want to have in your mind when you're looking at an animal and trying to figure out what it is are over here. You know, is it big or is it little? Is it on the land or in the water? What kind of symmetry? Does it have a head? Does it have segments? Is it soft and squishy? Is it hard? These are all the things that any observational guide is going to run you through to try to classify it to phylum. And so these are good things to notice yourself and encourage students to notice. And these are just some resources, some of the ones that I go to first when I'm trying to figure out what some animal looks like or where it lives, etc. You may know all of these already. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few slides that are getting into a little bit more sort of theoretical nitty-gritty about animal biology. And mostly it's to share with you a little bit of my perspective on what I think is important to pay attention to, regardless of whether you know what kind of animal it is. If you're just kind of looking and seeing an animal and trying to make some sense of what it's doing or where it's living or how abundant it is. And so if we ask the question, what do animals need? Obviously they need food. These are the organisms that eat other organisms. So they must have food. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. Their food, they're getting carbon to build the molecules in their body. And when they break the bonds in the organisms they eat, they get energy that they can recycle for their own processes, whether that's building up bigger molecules to build their own bodies or to do stuff. Okay, so their food is both their carbon and their energy source. So obviously they need food. I'll talk more about that in a minute. They need habitat. And at the base approximation, habitat's where the food is. But there's some other factors that are also important. And temperature is a huge one. And we'll talk more about that in a second. Temperature is a real big deal. And so there are many abiotic factors, that is, non-living aspects of the environment that are important for any organism to exist in a particular habitat. But temperature is a big one for animals. And I just want to put a plug in for architecturally complex environments and contiguous habitat, because the more architecturally complex a habitat is, the more niches there are for animals to either hunt or hide. So when I say architecturally complex, it could be a coral reef, it could be a tropical rainforest with lianas and things hanging all over the place. It could be just, the layer of soil and moss and thatch and detritus from last year's leaves falling. But these complex environments tend to be very diverse with animals. Contiguous habitat becomes super important the bigger the animal is. And so this slide down here is showing just sort of classic managed forest mosaic with some patches of clear cutting. And there may be some smaller animals, like a rodent or a louse, that won't really care about this, landscape view. But for larger animals that require more space, more habitat, more food, it's going to be a big issue to not have continuous suitable habitat. So size matters. Little animals have more opportunities for sure. And then finally, mates are important, and reproduction is vital for maintaining a species, for preventing extinction. And the real take-home point here is that population sizes determine whether you have access to mates that are genetically different than you are, and whether your populations can stay viable. And good habitat supports good populations if resources are available, resources like food. Okay, so all these things are super important for animals, but I want to focus a little bit on the energetics related to food. And so there's really two things that I try to get students to really understand when they're looking at any animal. And one is how they get their warmth. How they get their warmth makes a difference. And the other is their size makes a difference. So when we're talking about how animals get warm, we can divide animals into two categories: ectotherms and endotherms. And the first question might be, well, who cares if they're warm? Okay, but all chemical reactions go faster if you're warm. And so anything an animal is doing, whether it's metabolizing its dinner, digesting its dinner, or making eggs, or running around looking for mates, all those things are going to happen more quickly, more efficiently if the animal is warm. And so warmth actually matters. Ectotherms are those animals that get their warmth from environmental sources. They bask in the sun, they lie on a warm rock, and that warmth is going to speed up their metabolism. And this is all animals except for birds and mammals. And it's a really great lifestyle because it's very flexible and it's very efficient. So if it's warm out, they can bask in the sun and get warm and then run around and do stuff. And then when it gets cold, they just completely chill out. They can just, crawl into the mud and wait a month or two. And they can do this because when they get cold, their metabolism slows down, which is what you would expect. And they can just hang like that with this slow metabolism, little need for oxygen, little need for food. Everything just gets put on pause for a while. And then they just warm back up again when things get warm again and they run around again. So very efficient, very flexible. It tends to be considered as some kind of, inferior lifestyle. But endothermy, which is the alternative, has some severe costs. Okay, so endotherms are mammals and birds, and they alone are getting that heat to keep themselves moving from their metabolism. And their metabolism is coming from the food. So they eat food to get warm so they can run around to get more food to stay warm, so they can run around to get more food to stay warm to run around, which is a little bit of a, why is that a good thing? That seems like a vicious cycle. It's very expensive. They do spend an enormous amount of their food energy keeping their body temperatures up. Okay, and they all have insulation because of that. It's no accident that birds have feathers and mammals have fur, because heat is expensive, and so they insulate it. So where's the good news here? The good news is that birds and mammals can be running around in the day. They can be running around in the night. Doesn't matter if it's chilly. They can keep moving. They can stay alive. They can do what they need to do. It's also nice because they can live in cold climates. They can live in warm climates. They can hang out through the seasons, summer, winter. It's all good. They have this amazing ability to thrive in a wide variety of habitats, a wide variety of temperature regimes. The problem is, what do you do when the food runs out? And when the food runs out, they're in trouble. They either have to find a way to lower their metabolism so they don't need food, or leave town. And we see both these strategies in birds and mammals, and they're pretty conspicuous. Okay, so what we have up here is just a cute drawing from a Bernheinrich book of a chipmunk hibernating. Hibernation is the process of dropping one's body temperature down quite a bit, which drops down oxygen rate, oxygen needs, heart rate, respiratory rate, etc. Torpor is a mild hibernation. It's just a little bit of a lower metabolic rate. And so there are mammals that will hibernate or undergo torpor. More conspicuous in birds, and then also seen in some mammals is migration. If you haven't looked at the videos on MoveBank, I highly recommend this website. It's super cool. Basically, it's a repository of all geotagged animals that have been satellite tracked, and we can see migration patterns. And so this particular picture is birds of North America, and it shows the movement of birds up and down the West Coast Flyway and the breadbasket flyway and a couple little eastern patches. But you can see these animated, and you can see them for any part of the planet that you want. Birds migrate, a lot of whales migrate, some larger mammals migrate. So migration and hibernation are essential when the food's not available. So to be an endotherm is great, but you better insulate it. And if the food runs out, you need to have another strategy. So two different strategies, and they both help inform why animals are doing what they're doing. The other thing that's really important to think about when you're looking at an animal is, how big is it? Because size has really drastic physiological consequences, really drastic energetic consequences. And these are somewhat tied in with, are they ectotherms or endotherms? And it can get kind of tricky thinking about this stuff. So I'm just going to kind of run through it and give you a couple of examples. But the bottom line is size determines the surface to volume ratio of an object. Okay, so for any object, as it gets bigger, its surface area is going to increase as the square of whatever its linear dimensions are, however long it is. Okay, where the volume is going to increase as the cube of its linear dimensions. So the bottom line is that as things get bigger, the volume gets bigger faster than the surface area gets bigger. So the surface area gets outpaced by the volume. And I mean, this is true of a cup of coffee. If we take a really big cup of coffee, it's going to lose heat while it sits on your desk. When you forget about it, it's going to lose heat through its surface area much more slowly. It's going to cool much more slowly than a small cup of coffee. Why is that? Because the large cup of coffee has a lower surface to volume ratio than a small cup of coffee. So it's going to lose heat. The whole volume has heat, and it's going to lose that heat through its surface area. Okay. So the basic idea is that when you apply this to organisms, is that the organism is the volume. The cells pack up the volume of the animal. The volume has needs. The volume needs food. The volume needs to be warm to run its basic bodily functions. But there are processes that go through the surface area that are important for feeding that volume. Okay. And these processes are different for ectotherms and endotherms. Ectotherms, if they get really, really big, they have a low surface to volume ratio, like any big thing does, but they're getting their heat from their surface. They're lying in the sun, right? They're absorbing heat from their surface. So what we see here is Argentinosaurus, which is a really, really, really big herbivorous dinosaur. Definitely an ectotherm, though we know endothermy did evolve in dinosaurs on the lineage leading to birds. So here we have a very large ectotherm. It's a large thing, so it has a low surface to volume ratio. And what that means is it's going to be getting heat through its surface, and that's going to warm up its volume really slowly, but it's going to lose heat through its surface, and that's going to cool its volume very slowly. And be like, well, why do we care about that? We don't even have dinosaurs anymore. And this is partly why we don't have these big ectothermic dinosaurs anymore, because they were, there are other reasons, I know about asteroids and all of that, but they were abundant when the planet was quite a bit warmer. Okay, these guys wouldn't do so well in the temperate zone now. It would take too long for them to warm up, especially in coastal Humboldt County. To take a contrast, okay, we're going to, a diametric contrast. We got a really tiny, tiny, tiny animal. Here's a human. This shrew that I have figured would be about the size of a couple toes of the human. All right, so orders of magnitude smaller than the dinosaur, but also an endotherm. It's a mammal, so it's an endotherm. So it's very, very small. It has a very high surface to volume ratio. Endotherms are they're generating heat with their volume, not their surface area. Okay, they're generating heat with their volume. So they have this sort of tiny volume and a huge surface area. So they generate heat with their volume, but they're dissipating it through their surface area really rapidly. Okay, so because they're endotherms, it's the volume responsible for heat, and that's responsible for how much food they need and how active they can be. And the consequence of this for the real live shrew is that they can't stop eating. Shrews are active day and night. They're running around all the time. They can barely keep pace with their own heat loss with their voracious appetite. So when you're looking at animals, how big they are and whether they're ectotherms or endotherms has consequences for their daily behaviors as they're related to the acquisition of food. Okay, I'm just going to leave it there and let you chew on that, see if any of that made sense. All right, we can talk about whales and elephants later if you want. Okay, so moving away from energetics, how do animals interact? We've been talking about what does an individual animal need, but of course nobody lives in isolation, except this past year has been a real test for humans. They interact with their own species, and they're going to need to interact with mates on some level. Animals are going to need to they may interact with offspring. They're certainly somehow going to be involved in generating offspring, and there may be social interactions. And so just a few images here. when you're looking at animals, the more sexually dimorphic they are, in other words, the more the males and the females look different from one another, that's always a clue that there's something interesting going on with mating and social behavior. And we've got a mandarin duck and we've got some elk over here. As far as offspring go, mammals always get, the sort of the prize for being the animals that are most devoted to their offspring, partly through this prolonged process of nursing. But in fact, there's quite a lot of other animals that will tend to their young, tend to their eggs. Even the lowly centipede over here will protect its eggs. You can see this very commonly in local forests. And then social interactions, animals range from being absolutely solitary except for mating to being extremely social, and the social insects and naked mole rats in particular. But here we have a beehive. These are some social bees, but not all bees are social, they're solitary bees. So we have this huge spectrum from solitary to social across animals, even within animal groups, smaller animal groups. So there's a lot of variety there. And I'm not going to talk about any of that anymore. Let's think about how they interact with other species. And here we start moving into more traditional community ecology. And so you can guess I'm going to talk about trophic interactions because animals are all about eating, and these end up being really important in community ecology. Other ways in which animals are interacting with other animals and plants and other things in their environment are competitive interactions, which are when two organisms are competing for resources, and then symbiotic interactions, which are when two organisms have some kind of intertwined complementary dependency. Both of those are great topics, but we're just going to stick with eating. All right, so we all know about food chains and trophic webs, and here are some pictures. The ones on the left are a little more sort of typical textbook views. We've got a terrestrial habitat, we've got an aquatic habitat, and we can see our food chain or our trophic web starting with the tiny little things in the soil or in the plankton. And in this aquatic system, we'd be moving up from phytoplankton to zooplankton into a planktivorous fish who gets eaten by a carnivorous snapping turtle. And there are these lovely little arrow diagrams that we can draw for different communities. But I really love this. This is from a museum that I went to once, and it's just like, yeah, there's the reality of it. That's what it really looks like. It's crazy. And part of the reason it's crazy is that we don't all eat the same thing all the time, and the same foods aren't always abundant all the time. So it's not ever as simple as we think. But my point is that because animals are those organisms that eat other organisms, they're going to play a really important role in structuring the distribution and abundance of other species in their communities. And this is a general principle in community ecology. And I just have a caveat here because I don't want people to think that I'm saying that, the top predators are everything. In ecology, there's always a tension. In any ecological explanation, there's always a tension between what we call top-down explanations, where it's the predators that are affecting the distribution and abundance of the organisms lower in the food chain, and bottom-up explanations, where it's the resources that are affecting the distribution and abundance of the organisms that are higher up in the food chain. And whenever you have a question, why are there so many of this, or why are there so few of that, or why aren't there any, penguins here? Oftentimes you need to consider both these explanations and the job of types of explanations. And the job of being a professional ecologist is to actually tease out all of the variables that might be involved, top down, bottom up, and other, going back to that other diagram of the food chain that we saw in the previous slide. So just with that caveat that there's all different kinds of explanations, I want to give you an example of a way in which animals can drastically affect their communities. This picture down here is a local photo of what is not so affectionately referred to as a sea urchin barrens. The idea is that there used to be algae and tide pools with all kinds of organisms, and you could spend hours trying to identify all the different phyla in one tide pool. And now there's nothing but purple sea urchins. So this transition has happened in some places on the local coast in a matter of years. And one explanation for why this has happened, why we have these broad patches with nothing but purple sea urchins, has to do with this organism, which was the top predator in the tide pools. This is the sunflower star. It's big, dinner plate size, kind of floppy sea star, but it was one of many species affected by sea star wasting disease. Sea star wasting disease decimated sea star populations. In this particular species, it appears more than others. And so if you take these predators out of the tide pools, then you get one of these top-down effects where lower levels are going to have exploding populations because you don't have the predator control. So this is just one super clear-cut example of a top-down explanation and an example of how animals can structure their communities. This is a pathological example. There's many more examples that are keeping the nice normal balance in a community as well. Okay, so getting out of the theory, where do we find animals in Humboldt County? The answer, of course, is everywhere. If you look in the forest, right? Look everywhere. In the soil, this is where you find the lesser phyla. This is where you find the tardigrades. In the trees, in the bark, between the cracks in the bark, under logs. That's where you find salamanders and centipedes and worms and all kinds of things, under cover objects, at the beach, on the sand, in the sand, between the sand grains, lesser phyla there, in tide pools. Change sand to mud and it works for mud flats. There's animals everywhere, in ponds and streams, in the water, on rocks, under rocks, in the muck in the bottom of the stream. Okay. And so these are, especially if you have a microscope, you can go crazy with animal diversity in these kinds of places, but also, you know, your house is amazing, and cracks in sidewalks and under streetlights. Urban environments have plenty of animals. This is a picture of arthropods from houses. This is from a study done in the southeastern US, but of all the rooms, of all the houses that they looked at, only 5 rooms had no arthropods. And the abundance of the different groups was a little different than in the wild. Normally beetles are the most abundant, but in houses, flies, spiders, beetles were the most abundant groups. And the species in any given house ranged from 20 to 200 species. So this is when you start, you need to start looking in the corners of your houses. Rooms with a door to the outside world and rooms with carpets have the highest number of animals in them, apparently. So look everywhere. Other evidence of animals. This is from the animal diversity website's Kid Corner, whatever they call it, BioKids. And they have little guides to recognizing animal sign. And so tracks and chew marks and things animals build, and eggs and skulls, but they don't have is holes. And there's some new field guides to animal holes that are great, because you see holes everywhere and you wonder, like, who made that hole? And these are just some local pictures, or not all local actually, some bear scratch and some caddisfly, caddisfly larvae casings, beautiful tracks from the Van Dusen River after a big flood event. We have an egg collection at College of the Redwoods. And so if you find eggs, we can help you identify them. This is a picture I took recently that's just showing some bite marks. Somebody was taking all the leaves off the yuccas, and we were measuring the teeth, trying to figure out what they were. We think it was the wood rats that were biting the yuccas. So often this is what you see. You see the sign, and I know Allison is going to emphasize this later. And so you need to be a good detective and look for other kinds of evidence out there. And then, if you see an actual animal, just keep looking, keep watching, because most people look and then look away and they're on to the next thing. And there's no substitute for looking for a really long period of time. And I tell my students, you don't really have to know. You don't have to be a birder. You don't have to know what kind of bird it is. If you lie on your back and you look at a bird fly, pay attention to the shapes of the wings, because the shapes of the wings and how they fly are quite correlated. And you'll notice that if you just stay still long enough to watch. And I'm a big fan of Sit Spots. This is a beautiful book about a tree, one tree, but so much observation of animals happens by watching one tree more or less every day for a year. So usually it's all about slow down, and I think I'm preaching to the choir on this one. I do really like field notebooks, any kinds of recording and drawing, partly for the record, but really, frankly, when we slow down to write about it or draw it, we notice more because we slowed down. So these are all sort of standard natural history strategies. But the questioning is what I want to end on here, or almost end. And that is, as soon as you look at something for a while, you start asking questions. It's our nature as humans. And kids, kids especially, because they're less inhibited, will ask questions like crazy. And I think that we get less comfortable answering our own questions with time. And I think this is something that I feel really strongly about when we think of science as this rarefied activity that you have to go to school to learn how to do, when in fact, science is an organized way of thinking that uses hypotheses and deductive logic to answer questions. And it can be done by anybody in your backyard, and it can be done in your kitchen. People do it when they're trying to figure out why the cookies tasted different when they forgot the egg. And you make a hypothesis. Well, maybe the egg was what made it chewier. And then the next time you add the egg and it gets chewy again. So I guess, we're taught that the scientific process looks like this. And I've talked a lot about observations, and I know that, a lot of what we want kids to do is observe, but we all need to be observing. This is the foundation of science, like Allison said. And the questions arise naturally. And scientific thinking, you come up with a hypothesis and then you test the hypothesis. And if it, fails the test, or it doesn't quite seem like you thought it was going to be, you kind of revise your hypothesis, you revise your question, or you get new observations. And this is how it's supposed to be in school, for scientists. This is how scientists think. But it's a very natural process that Ken Norris, who's he was a faculty member at UC Santa Cruz, and he was a marine mammal researcher, but known mostly as a natural historian. And he started the UC Santa Cruz Natural History Field Quarter Program, and was partly responsible for starting the UC Natural Reserve Program. Great naturalist, great mentor. He referred to this whole thing as spinning the wheel. That's what we're doing when we go through this cycle. We're spinning the wheel. We ask questions, we come up with hypotheses, and then we look closer and see if it makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, we have to throw it away and start again. So he says his throwing away muscles have to be as strong as his asking muscles. And this is something that we can all do. And so I encourage my students to do it, because oftentimes we can figure out the answers to our own questions, and we don't have to identify the animal. We don't have to look it up on a website. We can just figure it out on our own. These two pictures here are from an example that my students came up with all by themselves. They were just out for a walk and down at the wildlife refuge, and somebody noticed a tree frog sitting in an alder leaf. And then they saw another tree frog in an alder leaf. And then they realized that the alders were filled with tree frogs. And they started with why are they there? And they started shooting out hypotheses and then looking closer. And they came up with some really nice ideas for why all the frogs were sitting in the alder leaves on the wildlife refuge. So I think it's something that we all need to do more. I'd like to end right here, but this is sort of the bummer slide. It's not really a bummer, but there is fear of nature out there. And I just want to be real rational about it. Probably locally, the biggest risk in terms of bites and stings is Lyme disease. But being vigilant makes a huge difference. Checking yourself for ticks is a really important thing. You can cover your body, you can use chemical repellents, but the most important thing is to check yourself. And I tell my students, check yourself now, check yourself tonight, check yourself tomorrow morning, and you check every part of your body. And if you don't get bitten by a tick, you can't get Lyme disease. If you do get bitten by a tick, and there's a chance that you have contracted Lyme disease, save the tick. People throw the ticks away. Save the tick. That's very important. Put it on a piece of duct tape and save it, because public health can test it. Toxins, all amphibians have glands that secrete toxins. They won't absorb through your skin and kill you, but if you then eat your sandwich, you might feel bad afterwards. So always wash your hands after handling wild animals. You also wash your hands when handling amphibians because their absorbent skin will absorb everything on your hands, and that's not good for them either. Pathogens, hantavirus is carried in mouse poops, but the mouse poops need to be dry. This is a low incidence of hantavirus, but it is present, has been detected in Humboldt County. Mouse poops are a little smaller than a grain of rice. And like I said, it has to be dry. So if you see mouse poops when you're cleaning out a garage or a drawer or a back room, just put some bleach and water in a spray bottle, spray it down, get it wet, wipe it up, you're good to go. Okay, just don't be hanging out in dusty, dry places, sniffing rat feces or mouse feces. Rabies, stay away from animals acting strangely. If you see a bat walking down the sidewalk during the day, that's strange behavior, and you should call the wildlife rescue folks or HSU, and they can deal with it. But don't, foxes should not be coming up to you to say hi. And foxes, skunks, and bats all have had rabies locally. And then finally, you can get parasites. That's true. But usually in food animals, if you cook your food, it's not a big deal. There's a really notorious roundworm in raccoon feces. Pretty low incidence, but raccoons latrine. They'll poop in the same spot every day. If you notice that in your house, clean it up, pour some boiling water on it or bleach and water on it, and you're good to go. But it's a parasite you don't really want. And and I'm putting these things here not to freak people out, but just the opposite. These are the biggest risks, and every single one of them you can prevent and be rational and send your kids out to play in the dirt because it's good for them. And always, always, always wash your hands before you go play in the dirt and afterwards. And if you're going to handle animals, which I don't recommend, except for occasionally amphibians, remember that stuff on your hands is bad for them too. All right, so since I ended with the bummer, I have to go to a pretty picture and a nice sunset, and just thank you guys for your time and the opportunity to be here.
Thanks, Karen. Loads of good info. Really appreciate that. And Karen is sharing her PowerPoint with us, and so that will be available in the lessons and resources page. So if you're wanting to use any samples of this for your own teaching or your own reference, that will be available to you all. And if you could stop sharing your screen, Karen, I will hop over to mine. Thanks. Okay, so Karen gave us a lot of great background information, and I just want to put it in a nice little package for you in terms of what you can actually do outdoors with your students through a simple outdoor exploration activity, remembering also that playing outdoors is an important part. And so taking a moment for that with this slide here of my son. So this activity is just a simple search for animal signs. He and I tried this out the other day of the materials that I put together. And these were just all signs that we found within a 1-minute walk of our home here. So bear scratches on a tree, someone living in that tree, look at that hole there, and some deer tracks. So I put together this wildlife signs checklist with different categories of things to look for. And this is made so you could cut it in half and put it in your nature journal. And truly for each, say, outing, your students could complete a different one of these with noting the location and the date. And this is just like taking inventory, doing careful observation of what you see, what you hear. You're also looking for animal signs. That includes what sounds you're hearing from insects, birds, frogs, etc. And occasionally what you smell. So very simple, observing closely, using the senses, recording your observations, and then asking questions. Some things that you might find, like we found this. My son, he is almost 9 years old, zillions of questions pouring from his mouth about this. How did this happen? Who did this? How did this tail break off at a perfect squared angle here? Will it regrow another one? How long has it been here? On and on and on. So like Karen was saying, the asking of the questions is the foundation. It's the most important part here. The observations get us there. And so with those questions, you can keep churning through that scientific process of trying to answer your own questions, and that leading to asking, finding even more things to observe and asking even better and more refined questions. Oh, I'll play this for you here.
We were literally looking for wildlife and we found a frog.
So you may even find actual wildlife, not just wildlife signs. And friendly reminder for you that all of these webinars live at HCOE's environmental education page. See this Deepening Sense of Place webinars tab down here. When you click on this, it brings you to this page where all of these webinars are archived, and along with this orange box here for each one, which is where the lessons and resources live. And when you click on that, it brings you to this hyperdoc that contains all of the links and things that we've discussed, plus loads more, so that you can really help make this a part of your curriculum. So just sampling through here quickly, here's a little bit more about the simple outdoor exploration activity, where to find this printout, as well as a detailed printed field guide for you about recognizing different scat, recognizing different types of holes in trees and logs and things, recognizing different tracks. And some great lessons that we've curated for you from different sources. I love this local one from the folks up at Howland Hills Outdoor School outside of Crescent City, who have a whole thing about structure and function of banana slugs. It is so well done, and it's only about 7 minutes long, going through really clever, like sped up footage and stuff of the banana slugs and how they move, how they feed, how they sense the world around them. And different curriculum lesson plans for you if you want to dive deeper into the ectotherm, endotherm business, needs of living things, and then also directing you towards lessons that I pulled for you from the Education and the Environment Initiative curriculum, taking you through different aspects of what it's like to be an animal, what the needs, what the issues are, what the strategies are, what the adaptations are. And I pulled these for first, third, sixth, and high school grade levels. And then also remembering that there are a wealth of field experiences out there in the greater Humboldt County area, and that we have available at HCOE's website, the Environmental Education Guide, which is a great way to find out which organizations like Bureau of Land Management, Friends of the Dunes, North Coast Regional Land Trust, Sequoia Park Zoo, etc., are offering what programs for what grade levels, and how do you get in touch with them to be able to schedule those field trips, or even at this point, all sorts of organizations are doing virtual field trips as well. And then I just want to remind you that coming up next month is our last session in this series on First People and Traditional Ecological Knowledge with Mary Kate Lowry. That is on May 12th, so looking forward to that. And when this comes to an end, you will be directed to our very quick but useful and important post-webinar survey. So please do take a moment to complete that. And thank you to HCOE and CDE for funding this work, and to Karen for participating today and sharing such valuable information with us. I really appreciate it, Karen. Let me stop my share there. And I wonder if anyone has any questions for Karen at this point, or did she just do such a thorough job that your mind is full and you are ready to dive headfirst into the world of animals, which is totally okay if that's the case. But I'll share Karen's contact information with the resources too. So if you have things that come up further, I am sure she'll be happy to get in touch with you. And if that's it, I'll just go ahead and end our webinar then and say thank you for participating, and thank you, Karen, again for sharing your knowledge with us. Much appreciation. All right. Bye, everyone.